You're number one on our hit list. We're going to get you. You see day after day the aircraft invading your airspace. You see the circumnavigation of your home islands by the aircraft, by vessels now. And you're uncertain about America's support. You're uncertain about Japan's support. You're uncertain about Vietnam, all these other countries that may come to our assistance. We don't know. Of course, you're going to be demoralized. They get a sense of futility. We cannot win. What can we do but just surrender and let them march in? So it's to build the sense of futility, the sense of we are doomed in the minds of the people of Taiwan. The constant narrative from the CCP propaganda organs is inevitable victory for China. You will lose.
Welcome back, everyone. The Chinese Communist Party is moving forward with its plans to overtake Taiwan. This is something they've been planning for a long time. Now they're advancing these policies, according to recent reporting. Now, to learn more about what's really happening, this unseen war taking place through political warfare and other means, we've invited to speak with us Kerry Gershaneck. He's author of the book, Political Warfare, Strategies for Combating China's Plan to Win Without Fighting. And Kerry, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thanks for having me, Joshua.
So I guess just first off, can you explain to us what political warfare is? And, this sounds foreign to a lot of people. What is it? And, why should the average American care about the idea of Chinese political warfare?
Americans ought to care about political warfare because that's the means that the Chinese Communist Party is going to employ or hopes to employ to defeat the United States, to annex Taiwan without fighting a kinetic war. Doesn't mean they're going to defeat us. They're going to overtake us as the global hegemon, to use their terminology, without struggle. They intend to have a lot of struggle, invest a lot of effort, but they want to win without going to kinetic, conventional, or worse types of warfare. And so their approach is to divide and conquer us through subversion, through infiltration, through buying media, through media warfare, through psychological warfare, through legal warfare called lawfare, the three pillars of their political warfare, demoralize us, divide us, use their term, disintegrate us, so that we collapse without them having to send in tanks, bombers, and a lot of infantry and naval vessels, which they are preparing to use if political warfare fails.
Now, I want to go into some of these topics with you, how they plan to disintegrate the American system, how they're waging what you mentioned is, the three warfares, tactics of legal warfare, psychological warfare, and media warfare. I would talk about this in a minute. But first, let's talk about what's happening specifically with Taiwan. We recently saw the Chinese Communist Party overtake Hong Kong, and I know a lot of Taiwanese took that as kind of a shot over the bow. Is it realistic that they're going to invade Taiwan? Is this an unconventional takeover? How is this takeover going to look, and what are they planning right now?
With the Chinese Communist Party, nothing's off the table. They are at heart opportunists. They're Leninist. They have a tradition that goes back thousands of years that the Chinese Communist Party built upon regarding how to conduct political warfare, but how to conduct straight-on kinetic warfare as well. So they'll use any means to achieve the Chinese Communist Party's objectives. So invasion is not off the table. The approach that has been taken was to use political warfare to, again, divide, demoralize the people on Taiwan and have them just collapse and fall within the into the arms of the People's Republic of China without a fight. That hasn't worked. The people of Taiwan, where I lived much of the last 3 years as a Taiwan fellow, the people of Taiwan aren't buying it, and Beijing knows that. So they're building up the military side, as they've been doing for several decades, with the intent ultimately of using force if they have to, or they feel they have to, because political warfare is not working sufficiently to subvert the people of Taiwan, so it will collapse and fall into their hands. So again, nothing's off the table, Joshua.
When it comes to kinetic warfare, tanks, bombs, guns, planes, the kind of warfare we usually think of, I heard recent assessments saying that if the United States were to engage with the Chinese Communist Party, for example, for a war over Taiwan, that war games predict the U.S. would lose. I've also heard mixed analysis on this, though, that Taiwan itself could actually give the Chinese Communist Party a run for its money. And there's also the possibility of other countries stepping in, Vietnam, maybe even Japan, maybe Australia. What's the reality in terms of this? What have you seen?
I've been working with Taiwan, the Republic of China, for about 3 decades, and a lot of that was on the military side. There's improvements that President Tsai is making right now to the defense capabilities of Taiwan that are long overdue. There's been policies the United States has inflicted upon Taiwan that contributed to the weakening of its defense. Internally, there's got to be a lot of changes which are beyond the scope of our discussion today, but that's another good 1-hour discussion of improvements that Taiwan needs to make to better its armed forces and its capability nationwide. Key term here. It's not just the guys and gals in uniform with the fixed bayonets. It's everyone in Taiwan that needs to take a model from, say, the Baltic nations or Switzerland, to make it just hell on the PLA if they land any soldiers or Marines on Taiwan soil. Everyone is in the fight. Behind every tree, there's someone with a rifle, and they're going to be picking off these only sons of the families on mainland of the People's Republic of China and send a lot of them back in body bags. That's what is going to be needed, but again, beyond the scope of the political warfare discussion today. So a lot of work needs to be done, but again, President Tsai, to her great credit, is making great progress with the team she has in place there. And the United States, to its overdue credit, is now being much more realistic in the way it's supporting Taiwan. And so that means a lot more military sales, but I think a lot more intelligent interaction, and hopefully a lot more Taiwan Marine, Taiwan soldier, Taiwan airmen, Taiwan sailors side by side with Americans counterparts, and training together so that the capability of the gunfighters on the Taiwan side gets dramatically enhanced.
Now, a lot of people would say, wouldn't this work against the Chinese Communist Party if it took Taiwan, especially by military force? Wouldn't this set a bad example? Wouldn't it get it sanctioned even deeper or cut off from the international trade system? Or does the CCP have, protocols to deal with this already? In other words, is the benefit of the CCP taking Taiwan worth the backlash for doing so?
I'm not a psychologist, don't play one on TV, but I think in Xi Jinping's mind, it doesn't matter what the price is. They didn't care a hoot what the world thought when they basically took Hong Kong many, many decades before the agreement with England said that they were supposed to take total control. Didn't care about international concerns when they took Tibet. And, the genocide against the Uyghurs, they don't care. They have the world's most heavily resourced propaganda machine ever in the history of the world. It's the envy of Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. They have the most impressive, in a very malign way, political warfare, psychological operations, propaganda tools of any force in the history of this planet, and they intend to create a sense of amnesia within the world population, as they did about Tiananmen Square. Effectively, that massacre. Their hope is take it and everyone will forget. They'll just be rolling in money coming out of the PRC. That's why we have to get very serious about making it hell to pay for Beijing to even consider setting any PLA troops on Taiwan soil. You have to be able to effectively deter China, the People's Republic of China. You have to then be able to confront and defeat them militarily so they will stop and say, no, not worth the price.
Now, Taiwan has been kind of ground zero for a lot of the policies that the CCP is using in other countries, like the United Front,
exactly,
like psychological warfare, media warfare, academia takeovers, buying off politicians, these types of operations that kind of slow boil a society. Taiwan has pushed back against this. From what I remember, they even actually banned United Front operations. And as you mentioned, a lot of these operations are kind of generally well known in Taiwan. When you talk about political warfare, what is the lesson Taiwan has taken, and what are the areas that people in Taiwan look at? I mean, is this just common knowledge in Taiwan, or how is this viewed?
It's complex, Joshua. It's not as clear cut as we would like to think it is. Yes, Taiwan is number one on the CCP's hit parade. They got Hong Kong, and now to achieve what Xi Jinping and his China dream has euphemistically called reunification. It's annexation, but he calls it reunification of China. They have to take Taiwan in the CCP's mind. The United Front operations going on in Taiwan are multifaceted. They include retired military. They include they include people in government and retired from government. They include business. You cannot outlaw all of that. Complicating the issue, as I point out in my book, the chapters on Taiwan, we have the legacy of the White Terror, the KMT when they were in charge, and Chiang Kai-shek. It was a fascist regime. It was brutally repressive in its own right, nowhere near the level of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, what they were doing on mainland China. But there is that legacy after Taiwan democratized in the 1990s with President Lee, and there's again a study that I've made of that historical era in the book. After that democratization, there was a bearing of the national soul about what happened. And so in some sense, there was an overreaction to that period of fascism and repression. And so the laws make it that have been in place for many years make it difficult to go after people who are spying for the People's Republic of China, those who are organizing United Front organizations, the pan-red academics who infiltrate many of the very, very prestigious academic institutions that I saw when I was there over the past 3 years and over previous years. So it's a little bit more complicated issue there, but steady progress is being made, giving law enforcement the tools that it needs, giving it the legislation it needs. And then the military, again, has a very circumscribed role in that, but at least the military has the capacity to recognize political warfare. That capacity has disappeared throughout a large part of Taiwan's civil society. But at least the military, to its credit, has a cadre of personnel and a college, Fuxing College, where they do focus on PRC political warfare. So there's capacity within Taiwan, but it was repressed, and it's now they're slowly tapping into that capability to build a comprehensive strategy for dealing with PRC political warfare.
Now, you mentioned something earlier, which is this idea of this disintegration strategy they're using against the United States and how it relates to political warfare. What is this disintegration strategy? How does this work? Disintegration
means you divide a country. In Taiwan, you fund certain groups that are attacking other groups. You get the focus of America on internecine warfare. We're focused on denigrating other groups in our country. We're in bitter conflict internally. Hence, because of this bright, shiny bauble that is put up to us off to the side, distracting us, we're not paying attention to what the PRC is doing, whether that's through campaign interference, election interference, whether that's buying off, coercing, intimidating our Major League Baseball, our National Basketball Association, our major hotel chains. We just aren't focusing on that. We're so focused on fighting each other that we slowly collapse, we disintegrate without even recognizing the war the PRC is waging against us. That is a foundational element of the disintegration strategy. Get us to fight each other so we ignore the war that the PRC is waging against us.
Now we hear a lot of different sides to this. We hear in the U.S., for example, academics, think tanks taking a lot of money from the Chinese Communist Party. We hear about politicians going on paid trips to China. We hear about student groups tied to the Chinese Communist Party, like the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, the Confucius Institutes, for example. We hear about media organizations having paid dinners and trips with the Chinese Communist Party. And you mentioned that it seems to be the case that there's kind of an orchestration of front operations in order to create these illusions, whether it's distracting people, dividing people, turning people against each other, and so on. Is it accurate to say that these networks of influence, these infiltration networks, that they're used by the Chinese Communist Party in concert with each other to create events? Is this how it works?
Nothing happens by accident out of the Politburo. It's a very centralized effort under the United Front Work Department, under the Propaganda Department, which they have euphemistically changed the name to Publicity Department, but in Chinese they still refer to it as the Propaganda Department. All of this is very well orchestrated. Yes, there's some decentralization of operations and activities, but the bottom line, everything is very centrally orchestrated. The amount of money, the billions of dollars, especially since the 2004-2009 timeframe, but again, won't go into a great deal of detail on that, but on just media warfare, setting up platforms owned, operated by the PRC, but also co-opting, taking over once prestigious news organizations, taking over organizations globally, feeding, as they do in Southeast Asia, for example, in Africa. They have news organizations that have been well established in those regions that now basically just print or broadcast material that Xinhua, that China Daily, People's Daily, even PLA Daily, just feed them verbatim because of money, because of different ways that they either obtain cooperation or intimidate and coerce. So again, the effort globally is very well orchestrated in terms of media warfare, psychological operations, those three pillars, lawfare. It's very well orchestrated. The United Front Work Department is massive. The number that there's hundreds of organizations in the U.S. alone. There's organizations in Taiwan, as we've discussed, that the National Security, the NSB, the National Security Bureau, and the Ministry of Justice, they are aware of the role these organizations are playing, but right now they don't have the legal tools to go after these United Front organizations for fear that they'll be accused of repressing human rights and repressing the freedom of speech that has been so carefully and hard fought for in Taiwan.
Now, we talked briefly about media warfare, which is control of news outlets or information outlets, not just media organizations, but even social media, even online platforms of other types, controlling
Yes.
the ways people can communicate. But you mentioned that as well, that this is part of a three-tiered strategy, which is the three warfare strategy, which also includes psychological warfare and lawfare or legal warfare. How does media warfare tie into this, and what is the overarching strategy with the three warfares?
If you control the information that people get to use their cognitive abilities to make decisions, to understand the situational awareness of what's going on around them, you control the people. So, I mean, that's a given. That's a very, that's PsyOps 101. But they take, that's the foundation for this massive global effort to control news organizations, and not just make it appear that it's coming out of China. This is China's views, but making it appear that it's coming out of Zambia, that it's coming out of Malaysia. It's under what we used to call front organizations now, once legitimate news organizations that have been taken over effectively, either through money or infiltration or coercion, just buying the parent organization alone. You're able to dictate the news content and the editorial policies of those news organizations. So media warfare plays a massive role. The media warfare consists of social media warfare, as you've alluded to. That's a very powerful force right now. They intimidate through their social media warfare and their so-called netizens, millions of so-called netizens and their cyber army and the strategic support force, the PLA strategic support force. There's hundreds of thousands of people dedicated to just going online and having avatars or pretending they're somebody they aren't online, and attacking critics of the People's Republic of China, and it's disseminating PRC propaganda and support for those organizations that support and enable the PRC. So there's a very massive effort in terms of manpower, in terms of finances, in terms of facilities going on around the world.
Now, you mentioned the strategic support force. Now, going back to the Obama administration, everyone might remember Unit 61398, the group of Chinese hackers who were breaching Google and other sites. A lot of those organizations were reorganized, I understand, under Xi Jinping later on. One of the reorganizations of these operations was the strategic support force. And, you know, the old writings about General Staff Department, Third Department, which is Signals Intelligence, or Fourth Department, Electronics Intelligence, Second Department, Human Intelligence, were put into this new strategic support force. But, you know, for a lot of people, these are just empty and strange words. How would you explain this strategic support force, and how does this relate to these netizens?
The social media warfare that the PRC is able to conduct consists of again, there's a netizen element. The hyper-nationalization of the Chinese people by the Chinese Communist Party means that there's a lot of people who actually believe what they're putting online when they go on, the so-called netizens, the citizens who are out there posting their opinions. A lot of it, though, is contrived. A lot of it is people who are paid, the 50-cent army, they're paid so much for every posting that they get in support of the PRC's policies, objectives, propaganda operations. So that's the civilian side of it. The military side has its own audiences that it's aiming for. It has its own goals and objectives. A lot of it aimed at external military forces, but also in the case of the Strategic Support Force, the PLA does play a big role, say, in trying to undermine, to subvert and demoralize Taiwan. So these part of the Strategic Support Force is dedicated to the frontline effort against Taiwan. Again, a lot of the others are, it's global. So you have the political warfare component under the Strategic Support Force supporting the Chinese Association of Friendly International Contacts. That's the organization that subverts American retired admirals and generals, that co-opts them so they will write editorials in prestigious American newspapers calling for cutoff of arms sales for Taiwan, for example, or they'll advocate for America to step back from its aggressive activities by naval surveillance aircraft or other activities that supposedly injure the feelings of 1.4 billion Chinese people. You have retired admirals and generals of the U.S. Armed Forces doing that because of KFIC and how effective it was in co-opting them. So that's a brief overview of some of the work that the political warfare component of the Strategic Support Force provides to the CCP.
You mentioned as well the idea of demoralization. I understand that this was part of the Soviet-era strategy of ideological subversion, which was kind of the first stage of overtaking a country through unconventional means, through subversion, getting into the institutions and transforming it. You're suggesting the Chinese Communist Party is also carrying out demoralization operations. Can you explain to our audience what demoralization is and how the Chinese Communist Party is doing this?
Joshua, at the beginning of our conversation today, you talked about the effort against Taiwan by the PRC. A large part of that effort recently, especially since the re-election of President Tsai, has been a large uptick in the aviation, the People's Liberation Army Air Force and Navy aircraft that have been going into Taiwan's airspace and stressing the air defense capabilities of Taiwan. That's a psychological operation against the people of Taiwan and the military the military personnel, every bit as much as it is a preparation for a real attack in case Xi Jinping is foolish enough to order that. So let's look at the demoralization outcomes that the CCP expects by these large-scale interdictions of Taiwan airspace. The constant narrative from the CCP propaganda organs is inevitable victory for China. You will lose. Stand against us, you will lose. Stand with us, support us, and you'll be on the victory train. Okay, so you demoralize the people of Taiwan, according to CCP thinking, if you constantly show that their air defense capability, their aged F-16s, cannot stand up against our large amount of modern bombers, a lot of the aircraft, the fighters, et cetera, that they took our technology and applied it, gave it Chinese characteristics and built their own versions of it. You cannot win against us. Your air defense missiles, you haven't got enough of them. So it's to build this sense of futility, the sense of we are doomed in the minds of the people of Taiwan. This is the example you're looking for. That's how you demoralize the people. So you wind up with people whom I've met, and I've had conversations with very good people in Taiwan, but they get a sense of futility. We cannot win. What can we do but just surrender and let them march in? Most other people, to their great credit, there are built. They're able to understand the game that's being played against them with these air incursions, but they worry about that. And on a daily basis, think about that. On a daily basis, you're about 100 miles from this militarily and economically powerful, expansionist, brutally repressive, fascist totalitarian regime that has said, you're number one on our hit list. We're going to get you. And you see day after day the aircraft invading your airspace. You see the circumnavigation of your home islands by the aircraft and by vessels now that they're sending around. And you're uncertain about America's support. You're uncertain about Japan's support. You're uncertain about Vietnam, all these other countries that may, heavy emphasis, bold, italicized, underlined, may come to our assistance. We don't know. Of course, you're going to be demoralized if you don't have some other means, some other input to give you hope and give you capability to be able to deter, confront, and defeat that expected attack by the PRC if one is to listen to Xi Jinping.
You also mentioned how the Chinese Communist Party uses financial incentives with the purpose of creating dependence. And the interesting part of this, now we hear the Chinese Communist Party using its One Belt, One Road initiative. We hear about castle diplomacy, where it's building these mansions for African dictators. We hear about the CCP going and making deals with different countries' leaders and getting the countries themselves into debt traps and making deals that only benefit the leaders of the country. And we also heard, for example, Di Dongsheng, a member of Xi Jinping's Brain Trust, give a video-recorded speech talking about how the Chinese Communist Party controls American politics through control of finances. You mentioned in your book, though, this idea of how the CCP creates this dependency using finances. Can you explain to us how this works?
Sri Lanka provides an excellent case study, but you could look at South America, you could look at Africa, you could look at all the 130 or so countries that have signed up on the Belt and Road Initiative. How the PRC comes in, they offer all these wonderful infrastructure development loans, and all you have to do is give us, in the case of Laos, when they're building, offering to build the rail system for Laos, and they even made this offer to Thailand. Yeah, we'll build it, and but we get all the land on either side up to a certain number of meters out. That's sovereign territory of China. Okay, so those are simple examples. Again, Sri Lanka provides a classic example of we'll build this port that you don't need. That there is no study, economic feasibility study, maritime transport study. Nothing says that you will ever need a port of the size that we're going to help build you. but we'll loan you the money, then we'll build the port. And then when you cannot pay it back, it's just totally foreseeable, you'll never be able to pay that back, we'll renegotiate and take control effectively of that port on a 99-year lease. These are simple examples of what General Spalding, who former our National Security Council member or senior member of the National Security Council, called infrastructure warfare. That is the Belt and Road Initiative. You see these examples in Central Europe as well, where the elites are bought off. We call it elite capture. We'll pay you so much under the table. We'll make sure your sons and daughters, your princelings of Eastern European countries, similar to the princelings and the princesses of the People's Republic of China, we'll take care of them. Meantime, you just sign away your country's sovereignty, you sign away your country's economic interests to the PRC, and all will be good, at least for you personally, maybe not in the long term for your country. So this is how this is in small measure how this economic co-option, this elite capture works. Belt and Road Initiative, again, is a massive united front operation. It is a massive political warfare operation, every bit as much as it is the camel's nose under the tent for the People's Liberation Army, Navy, the PLAN, to have basing operations support globally.
Now, you mentioned the idea of this elite capture, and I've heard under the Trump administration some of the policies they had designating some of the United Front Work Department organizations, some of the front groups, as foreign missions of the CCP. The description of the United Front as an operation meant to basically control the elite of a society. To what extent would you say, based on your assessment and the organizations you've been watching, to what extent does the Chinese Communist Party control the elites in, say, Europe and the United States?
I couldn't give you a percentage, Joshua. I think that would be unfair. I'm not qualified to make that percentage evaluation if that's the answer that we're looking for here. What I can say is that if you do a pattern analysis, if you look at what we ignored as a nation out of naivety, out of willful ignorance, whatever the reason, what were we ignoring about the People's Republic of China military buildup, about their expansionist, their goals worldwide, about the brutally repressive, genocidal, fascist and totalitarian nature of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party? You have to remind people, it's the party state. There's no distinction between the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, the state. It's a party state organization. What did we ignore, and why did we ignore it? All these trends were obvious years ago. As I point out in my book, many in our senior Department of Defense, Department of State, the key people, National Security Council, under various administrations, chose to ignore that. Medeiros, who worked for Obama at the NSC, would say, well, we can't really pursue these issues because we need China's help with North Korea, or we need their help with Iran, getting a deal with Iran. The reality is we ignored it. And that was criminal negligence. So when you ask what's the degree of capture, I would say maybe that's not the right answer. Is look at what we failed to do when the evidence was there for us to act upon it. Look at the good people like U.S. Navy Captain James Fennell, who was the leading expert in the U.S. Navy on the People's Liberation Army Navy, and what they were doing, what China was trying to do globally. He was the one who called it early what they were going to do, building those artificial islands in the South China Sea. He was told effectively, sit down and shut up. It's not what the politicos want to hear. Why did we do that? Because we were captured one way or the other. Our elites were captured, whether it was ideological fascination with totalitarian regimes, and that exists in certain people, whether it was just peace, love, and happiness ideology that was instilled in them by the education institutions that have failed us in many regards, both on the civilian side and on our military academic institutions regarding preparation for this long, inevitable conflict with the People's Republic of China? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Americans allowed themselves to be fooled, allowed themselves to enable the PRC and the successes he had. Again, pattern analysis of what we failed to do and what we did do, and how hard it was to get done what, say, the Trump administration did, especially in the last several years of the Trump administration. It was incredibly hard for the Matt Pottingers, the Secretary Pompeo's, the Assistant Secretary Stilwell's, to actually get the ship of state headed in a better direction, not entirely the right direction. It was a massive effort to turn that ship of state in a better direction, because we had been captured or fooled through deception into accepting a rather benign view of the PRC.
Now, we hear about the Chinese Communist Party promoting this China model. We've heard their assessments, many top leaders in the Chinese Communist Party talking about it, their assessment that America's on the decline as far as they see it, and they believe it's now the Chinese Communist Party's time to rise. As they push forward with these operations, as they try to overtake Taiwan, as they move forward with the Belt and Road Initiative to take Latin America, Africa, Asia, and then gradually Europe and maybe the United States eventually, they're promoting this new form of government, and including with their new digital currency, which they've partnered with the SWIFT payment system to bring international. They're trying to also replace the US dollar as the global currency, which makes sanctions basically useless. If the Chinese Communist Party achieves its goal, what does that look like for the world? What is the China model?
You've quite accurately described key aspects of the attempt to usurp the role of the global hegemon here. The Celestial Empire, the center of the Celestial Empire, will again be China, and that world is a pretty grim world for anyone living outside China and for the vast majority of people living inside China. The China model that is being sold is more insidious than most Americans understand. For a long time, and I can't vouch for the current education system, but for a long time, Americans were raised to believe that democracy, freedom of speech, the amendments to our Constitution that gave us incredibly important rights that no other nation in history, we were exceptional, no other nation in history had quite the same rights and the same organization and to back those rights and laws to back those rights that we had in America. That we held up as the shining city on the hill for the rest of the world. And we were good for a period of time at displaying the virtues of America despite our faults. Now we're pretty much consumed with our own faults. We're fighting. It's not just bickering. It's very vicious internecine warfare in the United States. We doubt ourselves. That feeds into the PRC's narratives that I alluded to earlier. That we're going to win. Our model is best. Democracy is not for the rest of the world. Our model, our totalitarian model, which they don't call it that, they'll just say authoritarian rule, but it's totalitarian. Go to, Merriam-Webster is on our side on this one. Every element of the term fascist, every element of the term totalitarian, China fits it to a T. Words are important. We need to use the right vocabulary when we talk about the PRC, and we'll come back to how our own terminology is helping us stumble. It's helping us fail in our effort to counter the PRC. Hopefully we'll come back to that later. The point is, though, that the PRC is selling its totalitarian model as the most efficient, as the way to bring your masses out of poverty. Well, it's bringing the elites out of poverty, certainly the ones they're buying off and paying. And so that, for many countries, from the elite's perspective, hey, that's great. We don't care about the rest of the people anyway. We're going to get rich off this. And so the concepts we were raised to believe in no longer have resonance, because the China model shows you the path to wealth and the hell with human rights, the hell with the rule of law, To hell with everything that the UN was set up to achieve, what the U.S. Constitution and many other constitutions based on the U.S. Constitution and the post-Westphalian rights and the Magna Carta and all those other precedents for our Constitution. To hell with all that. It's the totalitarian model because we get rich from that. And we have unchallenged power as the elites in Africa, as the elites in Central Europe, as the elites in other continents. We will have unchallenged power because the PRC will give us the technology and the knowledge how to retain that power under their totalitarian China model.
Now, just last question. You mentioned, of course, the altering of language and the importance of using correct terminology. On this, do you feel there's anything we missed that you think is important to mention? And also, facing this whole scene, how do we not get demoralized? What can we do about this?
Thank you for opening up the question of terminology. We stumble in the fight against the totalitarian CCP because we have way too many terms that we use to describe what they're doing to us. I have a chapter in the book devoted simply to terminology that's used. It's overwhelming. It's dizzying the number of terms that we have. We use public diplomacy. We use psychological operations. We use soft power. We use hard power. Joe Nye, the soft power guy, keeps reinventing himself with some kind of new power, whether it's hard power, whether it's sharp, soft, all the different types of power. People get consumed and they delve into one aspect of that. I'm a diplomat. I do public diplomacy. Maybe I do public affairs, but I don't get involved in those other aspects. Everything else that's being done, maybe I'll deal with coercive diplomacy, the term that's been used here recently, especially with the wolf warrior so-called diplomacy of the PRC so-called diplomats. But we have this overwhelming array of terminology, which makes it easy for lazy bureaucrats or the uninitiated to say, I'm just going to do 2 out of these 25 terms because, I'm overwhelmed with my daily bureaucratic workload and I don't want to really, delve into that. Or I just conceptually, I can't tie it all together. A good general, a good admiral, a good military commander thinks combined arms warfare. You don't just fight with the ground forces, the infantry. You don't just fight with tanks. You don't just fight with cruisers and aircraft carriers or bombers alone and fighters. You tie it all together. It's like a symphony orchestra. You got to be good at that, though. You got to be a symphony conductor, and a good military commander knows to tie all those elements together. Same thing in a political warfare. It is warfare. It's the term the PRC uses in what they're doing against us. So let's just call all this what the PRC calls it. They say they are at war with us, Joshua. Let's believe them. Okay? Let's use that term to cover all the large array of terminology that I go into in my terminology chapter in the book. It covers everything. Makes it so much easier as a policymaker, as an elected official, to conceptualize then, how do we detect it? How do we deter it? How do we confront it? How do we defeat it? You can't do that if you don't get the terminology right. A large part of what I focus on in my book, and incidentally, if you have not seen it, it's available for free. Don't buy it on Amazon. The people that are selling it are bootleggers. It's they're making money off people. It's a free book. You can download it. In the book, I put a great deal of emphasis on education, Joshua. So what you're doing the Lord's work here on Crossroads. Kathy Hay and her great team of other journalists at Epoch Times. You're doing great work. You're on the front line of this battle because a large part of it is just getting an American public, which at the end of the Cold War, back in the early 1990s, that's 3 decades ago, Joshua, that's longer than some of your staff have been on planet Earth. That's a long time that we stopped teaching about enemies who use political warfare against us. It's been a long time that we stopped teaching our military leaders, our elected officials, our news media moguls, our entertainment moguls, our business and industry leaders about those nations that want to destroy us and how they employ political warfare against us. We did a good job in the Cold War. We stopped it after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of what we thought was the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. Education is key. So what you're doing, what Kathy and her great journalist compatriots over at Epoch Times are doing, what everyone else is doing at Jamestown Foundation, at Project 2049 Institute, for example, more and more organizations now are engaged in this information battlefield, in this ideological struggle. So the more we can encourage that, the better we can educate the American people, the easier it will be to get our own government to take the proper steps to, again, detect, deter, confront, and defeat the PRC political warfare existential threat that we face.
Hey, Kerry Gershaneck, real pleasure having you on Crossroads. Thank you.
Joshua, thank you very much for the opportunity.